Welcome to the Ask Junior Daily Judgment podcast. I'm Priya Sharma, and joining me today is Arjun Gupta.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be back with you for another episode. We've got a really fascinating case to dive into today, involving adoption, inheritance, and some interesting legal twists. But before we get to that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our podcast if you enjoy our daily legal breakdowns. Tons.
That's right. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue providing in-depth analysis of the latest court decisions. Now let's get started with today's case. We're going to be looking at the Supreme Court of India's decision in Sri Mahesh versus Sangram Ors. That versus is important to remember because it's a key part of the legal terminology.
Absolutely. So what's the story behind this case?
This case revolves around a complex family inheritance dispute involving adoption, property rights, and the interpretation of some key legal principles. The main player is Sri Mahesh, who was adopted by the widow of Bhavakana Shahapurkar. Bhavakana sadly passed away in 1982, leaving behind a tangled web of property ownership and inheritance rights.
Okay, so the dispute centers on the inheritance of Bhavakana's properties and the role of adoption in determining who inherits what. Can you break down the key legal questions in this case, Priya?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court had to consider a few critical legal questions. Let's break them down. 1. The entitlement of the adopted son. The first question was whether Sri Mahesh, the adopted son, was entitled to a half share of the properties after his adoption by the widow. This hinges on how adoption affects inheritance rights within the Hindu legal framework. 2. Validity of the sale deed. The second question involved the validity of a sale deed executed by the adoptive mother in favor of other defendants after Mahesh's adoption. This raises important issues about a widow's authority to dispose of property and whether an adopted son's consent is required in such situations. 3. Validity of the gift deed. Thirdly, the court had to assess the validity of a gift deed executed by the adoptive mother in favor of different defendants. This question required the court to delve into the legal requirements of a valid gift, particularly regarding delivery of possession and acceptance. 4. The doctrine of relation back. Finally, the court had to examine the applicability of the doctrine of relation back in adoption cases. This doctrine essentially states that once an adoption is finalized, the adopted child is considered as if they were born to the adoptive parents, acquiring rights to property as if they had a direct lineage. The court had to determine whether this doctrine could be applied retroactively to invalidate the previous transactions made by the widow before Mahesh's adoption.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. To make it easier for our listeners to understand, let's take a moment to define some of these key legal terms, shall we?
Great idea, Arjun. Let's start with the doctrine of relation back. Think of it like this. Imagine a family tree where a branch is added later on. The relation back doctrine says that even though the branch was added later, it's considered as if it had always been there, and the new branch inherits rights that are connected to the original trunk of the tree, even though the branch wasn't there from the beginning.
That's a helpful analogy. It clarifies that the adopted child's rights are backdated to the moment of the adoptive parent's death, as if they were born to the original family.
Exactly. Now let's tackle the concept of consent in this case. This refers to whether the widow needed Mahesh's approval before she could sell the properties.
And delivery of possession is essential for a valid gift, meaning that the recipient of the gift actually receives and takes control of the property.
That's right, Arjun. You're getting a good grasp of these concepts. So what did the Supreme Court decide in this complex case?
The court first addressed the question of Mahesh's entitlement as the adopted son. They upheld that adoption under the Hindu Adoptions and Maintenance Act, 1956, does establish the adopted child as the legal heir for all purposes, severing ties with the biological family.
This means Mahesh was considered a son of Bhavakana, granting him inheritance rights. The court considered the status of the properties before the adoption, acknowledging the impact of that status on Mahesh's claim to a share.
Next, the court looked into the validity of the sale deed executed by the adoptive mother in favor of the other defendants. They found that the widow had acquired absolute rights to the property through previous compromise decrees, giving her the authority to dispose of it without requiring the adopted son's consent.
So, despite the adoption, the widow could still sell the property, which is a really important point in this case.
Yes, it is. The court essentially ruled that the widow's rights to manage and dispose of the property acquired through prior legal proceedings remained intact even after Mahesh's adoption.
This leads us to the third point, which is the gift deed. The court found that the gift deed executed by the adoptive mother was invalid. Why?
Because the court found that the requirements for a valid gift under the Transfer of Property Act were not met. There was no clear evidence of delivery of possession and acceptance by the recipients of the gift.
In other words, there was no proof that the donees, the recipients of the gift, had actually taken possession of the property, which is a fundamental requirement for a legally valid gift.
Exactly. And adding to that, the court also questioned the claims that the donees were the grandchildren of the adoptive mother, as she didn't have any biological children. This raised further doubts about the authenticity of the gift deed.
So, in this case, the lack of proof of delivery of possession and the inconsistencies surrounding the donee's relationship to the adoptive mother led the court to invalidate the gift deed.
Now, let's delve into the final point, which is the relation back doctrine. This doctrine is important because it essentially asserts that Mahesh's rights to the properties date back to Bhavakana's death, even though he was adopted later.
You're right. The court had to balance this doctrine with the reality of the property transactions that took place before Mahesh's adoption. It's interesting to think about this principle, as it essentially says that an adopted child's rights are retroactive, applying to the time before they were even adopted.
The court concluded that while the adoption occurred after the widow's previous property transactions, the doctrine of relation back didn't invalidate the widow's legitimate alienations of property prior to Mahesh's adoption.
This means the widow's actions in selling the property, even though they took place before the adoption, are considered legally binding and do not diminish Mahesh's rights to the property that was subsequently gifted.
To summarize, the court upheld the validity of the sale deed executed by the widow, but it declared the gift deed invalid. Mahesh was ultimately recognized as the legal heir to the properties covered by the invalid gift deed.
So, the court's decision ultimately protects Mahesh's inheritance rights as the adopted son while affirming the validity of the previous sale deed.
This judgment highlights the complexities of family inheritance and how the courts carefully analyze these matters, applying legal principles and considering the circumstances of each case.
And that wraps up our analysis of this case. We hope you found our discussion informative and engaging.
Before we sign off, we'd like to remind our listeners once again to like, subscribe, and share our podcast. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you daily updates on the most important legal decisions.
Absolutely. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow for another exciting episode. Until then, this is Priya Sharma.
And Arjun Gupta, signing off. Thanks for listening to the Ask Junior Daily Judgment podcast.